So the paint bucket tool, quick key G, it's grouped in with our gradient, but we're going to work with the paint bucket. So depending on what your foreground color is, the paint bucket will paint that color. So if I switch to a different color, it works pretty much the same. It works with any layer that you have. So even though this was a locked background, it does change the color. If you don't want to use the color picker here, you can have your swatches panel open and just select the color you want. It's a little bit easier than opening up the color picker. If I add a new layer and I grab a different color, paint bucket, that one goes on top. You can also, let me clean this up here for a second. So I can paint in two different modes. I can paint in the foreground color, or I can paint in a pattern. So whatever the pattern comes up, when I click it, it drops in that pattern. I'm going to undo that and show you how you can change patterns. So this little flyout menu here, these are your categories for your patterns. So you click this one and grab any of those, it will paint the pattern. So if you try to put a second pattern on, a lot of times it doesn't really, the result doesn't come out the same because it's controlling where it goes based on where you're clicking your mouse. So if you want to try out a different pattern, it's best to wipe out the current pattern. That way you can see full screen on the canvas the result that you're going to get. So that's the basics of how you work with the paint bucket. If we switch to a document that actually has some content, for example, paint bucket, I can take, I'm going to switch back to foreground, and the little black arrow that you see with the icon is controlling where it's going to put the color with the paint bucket. So I can paint individual petals here, and I can grab a different color. Notice it's all going on to the background here. So I'm not going to color the whole thing. But the way it works, if you really zoom in and look at it, it's going to go until it meets a barrier, right? So the barrier in this case are the black pixels. So if I grab a yellow pick color, it's going to only go onto those pixels. So I'm clicking in the white. If I take my yellow, let me just switch to a different color. If I choose a different color and I click on the black, I'm going to zoom out. Whoops. It'll change all, because it's contiguous, all of those black pixels that are touching each other have all turned whatever color I chose here. So this also works with, let me F12 this thing back. It also works with patterns. So if I can target which parts I want to have the pattern. So that's pretty much what you can do with the paint bucket tool. I'm going to switch over here. Let me go back to the empty document and go over gradients next. So it's also grouped in with the same one here. And the gradient is based on foreground and background color. So if I want to apply the gradient, I can click and drag. And depending on where I click and drag and what direction, how long I drag, when I release the mouse, let me pick something that has a little bit more contrast here. You can see. So all a gradient is a blend of your foreground and your background color. There are linear gradients, which I just did. There is a radial gradient, There's the angled gradient, which I don't really ever use. So there's some different settings in here. You just can go in here and experiment with different things. I'm going to clean up my document. There are preset gradients you can choose from. So I'm going to go back to linear here. So these are some preset color schemes. So if you see something you like, and you drag it out, you can see what it does. There are categories as well. So you're not limited to what you see in the window. I can look through groups of categories here. So if I'm looking for mostly pastels, click OK. Now I have pastels, and you can kind of see what result you're going to get. If you look through here and you don't see what you want, you can actually build your own gradient. That is done through the gradient editor. So instead of clicking the drop down, we actually click on this bar, and that opens what's called the gradient editor. Okay, and there are color stops at the bottom, and they control what your gradient looks like. So this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 color stops. I can remove color stops by clicking and pulling down. I can reposition. I can, again, remove one. Let's say I wanted the color to jump to something more intense. So I can pick whatever color I want it to go to. So now I have a 3-color gradient. And if I wanted to move it, I can move it. I can also add another one. To add a color stop, you just click right underneath here. And now I have an additional color stop. It's going to look ugly, but get the idea here. So now I've built a new gradient that has all of these colors in it. And now it's going to reflect up here. And now you can see what that gradient looks like. One of the other things that's kind of interesting in the gradient editor, I'm going to go back in, let me F12. Right here, it's building a solid gradient. You can choose noise, which just is completely random. So when I switch to noise, my color picker, or my bar here, I'm not getting very good results. I'm going to hit randomize. So as I click randomize, you can see what it's doing. It's just coming up with whatever it wants. And it's kind of cool because you can drag it out. So there it is. Now, if I play with blending modes, I'm going to add a new layer. And I'm going to switch. I'm going to go back into my gradient editor and randomize a new color scheme, maybe something that's totally different. So this has got a lot of darks in it. And I'm going to, on a new layer, I'm going to drag out the gradient in the other direction. So I've got vertical and horizontal, and with the top layer selected, if I want it to react with the background layer with blending modes, I'm just going to use the down arrow and cycle through, and you get some pretty interesting results, some maybe not as good as others, but it's just a quick way to experiment a little bit. You can also change the opacity of that layer and see what look you want. So, and you don't have to always do linear with linear. You can try any of these different ones and play with the blending modes. So let's move on to this file here. So if you tried to apply, I'm going to go back to a normal gradient. If I just drag a gradient here, I can't color the picture. It wipes it out. So if you want to color in specific pixels with a gradient, it doesn't work the same as the paint bucket. You actually have to make a selection. In this case, solid color. I'm going to switch to magic wand. And if I select this cloud, I'm going to select a couple of them at once by holding down Shift. Now if I go to my gradient tool, it's going to pick whatever gradient I have. Now I can just go right over this and it'll stay within the boundaries of what's selected. And there I've colored in different things. So if you missed that, again, take the magic wand. Let's say I want to click just these two like trees, and maybe I want to go to my gradient. I'm going to build a new gradient. So pull these off. Maybe I want sort of more greens. So it's a slight green change, but I have these two selected. So depending on which way I drag, I'm going to get different results. So you can drag more than once, and you can see what you like in terms of, so again, it stays within the boundaries of what's selected. So paint bucket, now just to recap here, so if I'm in paint bucket, I don't have to select anything. It's just going to pick whatever I have selected, in this case foreground color. It's going to stay within those boundaries. So that's your paint bucket and your gradient tool.